Coughing blood into the mud behind the livestock pens, Dale Whitcomb watched through a swollen eye as his own brother, the sheriff, stood over him with a heavy service boot pressed against his shattered ribs. Above the roar of the county fair crowd, the jumbotron flickered to life. But it wasn't showing the family hardware store's demolition. It was broadcasting a set of blueprints that would poison the entire town's water supply. Silas leaned down, his voice a cold rasp over the festive music, and whispered a truth more painful than the beating. Their father hadn't left the legacy to all of them. He'd intentionally cut Dale out as a failure. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, and the first screams erupted from the grandstand, Dale gripped a wire stripper hidden in his palm, his last desperate tool to dismantle the life his siblings had built on lies. He was bleeding out in the dirt, a failure facing the two people who had just sold their town for a strip mine. But he had one final connection to make in the fair's electrical grid. The only question left was whether he would survive long enough to flip the switch that would destroy his family forever. The wrench slipped, skittering across the concrete with a metallic shriek. Dale Whitcomb exhaled through his nose, fingers already reaching for the tool before it settled near the oil-stained workbench. The garage smelled of motor oil and damp cardboard, the air thick enough to taste. He wiped his palms on his thighs, leaving streaks of grease on the faded denim, and crouched again over the engine block. The carburetor was a lost cause, corroded beyond saving. But he'd be damned if he'd let the old Ford die without a fight. His father had taught him that much. You don't replace what still works. The words echoed in the back of his skull, sharp as the edge of the screwdriver he'd just jammed into the stubborn bolt. The humid Missouri night pressed against the open bay doors, heavy and unyielding. Dale ignored the sweat stinging his eyes, focusing instead on the rhythmic click of the ratchet. This was his sanctuary, a cluttered world of steel and lubricant where problems had logical solutions. Here, he wasn't the brother who failed to leave town or the son who never quite measured up. He was the man who could make a dead heart beat again. The flickering fluorescent light overhead buzzed with a dying energy, casting long, jittery shadows across the cracked concrete floor. He reached for a rag, his hands moving with a practiced, mechanical grace, tracing the contours of the intake manifold. A knock rattled the side door. Dale didn't turn. Store's closed. The knock came again, sharper this time. Mr. Whitcomb? He set the wrench down with deliberate care. The voice was wrong, too polished, too official. The kind that belonged to men in cheap suits who carried clipboards like weapons. He wiped his hands on a rag, the fabric rough against his calluses, and turned just as the door creaked open. A stranger stood in the threshold, backlit by the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp. Mid-30s, maybe, with the kind of haircut that cost more than Dale's last grocery run. The man's shoes, black, shiny, clean, scuffed against the concrete as he stepped inside, already reaching into his jacket. Dale Whitcomb? The man's voice was smooth as engine oil, lacking the grit of someone who actually worked for a living. The envelope hit the workbench with a soft thwop, landing right in a puddle of fresh 10W30. Dale didn't touch it. He knew what it was before the man even opened his mouth. The way the server's throat worked, the way his eyes flicked to the rusted-out truck like it was already a relic, told the whole story. Mandatory buyout notice, the man said, his gaze darting toward the exit. Effective in 30 days. The city is exercising eminent domain on the hardware store property. Dale picked up the wrench again. The weight of it grounded him, a cold piece of iron against a world turning to ash. Get out. The man hesitated, just for a second, sensing the dangerous stillness in Dale's shoulders, before retreating. The door clicked shut, and outside, a car engine purred to life. Dale waited until the sound faded before he let himself breathe. The garage felt smaller now, the air heavier. He looked down at the grease-stained envelope. The Whitcomb family hardware store had stood for a century. It was more than brick and mortar. It was the only piece of the earth where he felt he belonged. He tore the envelope open, his pulse drumming a frantic rhythm against his thumb. The legal jargon was a thicket of whereas and herein, but the bottom line was a jagged blade. The municipality was seizing the land. He didn't wait for morning. The old Ford truck roared to life with a protest of blue smoke, and Dale hammered the gears, racing through the quiet, humid streets of St. Louis. The hardware store loomed out of the dark, its faded brick facade a ghost of better times. But as he pulled into the lot, he saw lights burning in the back office. His heart sank. He knew those cars. The sleek, silver sedan belonged to Elena. The black and white cruiser with the star on the door belonged to Silas. They were already there, moving like shadows behind the grimy glass. Dale shoved the front door open, the bell chiming a lonely, frantic note. The scent of sawdust and old metal hit him, usually a comfort, now a reminder of what was being stolen. He marched toward the back, his heavy boots thundering on the warped hardwood. He found them in the office, surrounded by open filing cabinets and half-packed boxes. Elena was dressed in a tailored blazer, her blonde bob perfect even at midnight, while Silas stood by the desk, his sheriff's uniform stretched tight over his broad shoulders. They were stripping the history from the walls, tossing ledgers and property records into cardboard crates with a clinical efficiency that made Dale's stomach turn. What the hell is this? Dale's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate the shelves. Elena didn't look up from her clipboard. It's over, Dale. The city's moving fast. We're just securing the essentials. Silas leaned against the desk, his hand resting habitually near his belt. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, brother. The papers were served. We're just following the timeline. The betrayal tasted like copper in Dale's mouth. They hadn't called him. They hadn't asked. They were treating the family legacy like a carcass to be picked clean before the sun came up. Elena finally met his eyes, her gaze icy and professional. It's for a municipal park, Dale. A green space for the community. The city's offering a fair price, more than this old fire trap is worth. She gestured vaguely at the stacks of invoices. Silas nodded, his face a mask of official boredom. The structural integrity is failing anyway. It's a liability. This way, we all get a clean break. Dale looked at the boxes, then at the empty space on the wall where their father's portrait used to hang. They were talking about a park, but they were acting like thieves in the night. The suddenness of it, the absolute lack of hesitation in their movements, screamed of a script they'd been rehearsing for weeks. I don't believe you, Dale said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. He ignored Elena's sigh and pushed past Silas, heading straight for the heavy oak filing cabinets. The deed is in here, the original charter. He began yanking drawers open, the metal screeching in protest. Elena stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply. Dale, stop. You're being hysterical. Everything is being cataloged by the city. He ignored her, his hands blurring as he sifted through yellowed folders. He was looking for the truth, for the one piece of paper that could stop this train. Silas moved to block him, his shadow looming large over the desk. That's enough. You're trespassing on a condemned site now, Dale. Walk away. The air in the small office grew thick with a different kind of heat. Silas signaled to the hallway, and a young deputy Dale recognized. Jake, a kid with a badge he hadn't earned the weight of yet, stepped into the doorway. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, the rookie said, his voice cracking slightly. Silas gave a sharp nod. "Escort him out, deputy. Use force if you have to." The kid reached for Dale's arm, his grip tentative but firm. Something snapped inside Dale. The years of being the soft one, the one who just fixed things and stayed quiet, evaporated in a flash of heat. He wrenched his arm away, his eyes locking onto Silas. "You're not taking this. Not like this." The deputy lunged again, more confident this time, trying to wrap Dale in a bear hug. Dale spun, his hand instinctively diving into his back pocket. He didn't find his wallet. He found the heavy, 14-inch pipe wrench he'd tucked there before leaving the garage. The cold steel felt like an extension of his own bone. As the deputy closed in, Dale swung the tool in a short, controlled arc, the heavy head catching the kid's shoulder and sending him stumbling back against the workbench. The sound of metal hitting bone was dull and sickening. Elena screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that felt like a needle in Dale's ear. "Dale, drop it!" Silas roared, his hand flying to his holster. But Dale was already moving, fueled by a desperate kinetic energy. He stepped into the deputy's space, pressing the cold length of the wrench against the kid's throat, pinning him back against the scarred wood of the workbench. The deputy's eyes went wide, his hands clawing at Dale's forearms. Out of the corner of his eye, Dale saw Silas draw his service weapon. The barrel of the Glock was a dark, bottomless hole pointed straight at Dale's chest. "Let him go, Dale. I swear to God, I'll put you down." The standoff was absolute. The silence in the room was broken only by the deputy's ragged gasps and the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. In that moment of frozen violence, Dale's gaze flickered downward. Near the base of the desk, right where Silas had been standing, he noticed a gap. A floorboard was slightly askew, the dust around it disturbed. He remembered that spot. Their father had installed a small floor safe there decades ago, a secret kept from the taxman and the banks. The wood was splintered, as if someone had pried it up in a hurry. He looked at Silas, then at Elena. They weren't just packing records. They were hunting for something specific, something they didn't want him to see. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They were hiding the real story. "You found it, didn't you?" Dale whispered, his voice rasping. He didn't wait for an answer. With a sudden, violent shove, he sent the deputy stumbling toward Silas, creating a second of tangled limbs and shouted curses. Dale dropped to his knees, his fingers hooking into the loose floorboard. He yanked it back, revealing the dark cavity of the safe. It was empty, except for a single thick manila folder tucked into the very back. He snatched it, the paper crinkling in his fist, and shoved it under his grease-stained flannel shirt. Silas was untangling himself, his face turning a deep, bruised purple. "Get him!" Dale didn't look back. He bolted through the office door, his boots skidding on the hardwood as he rounded the corner into the main aisle. He knew this store better than his own skin. He knew which floorboards creaked and which shadows were deep enough to hide a man. He dove behind a display of power drills, hearing the heavy thud of Silas's boots behind him. He burst through the front door, the night air hitting his face like a cold towel. He scrambled into his truck, the engine screaming as he threw it into reverse. Silas appeared under the street lamp, weapon raised. But the truck was already a blur of rust and taillights, disappearing into the maze of St. Louis backstreets. He drove until the city lights thinned, pulling into a gravel turnout near a shuttered warehouse. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely grip the steering wheel. He pulled the folder from his shirt, the sweat from his chest having dampened the edges. He clicked on the dome light, the small bulb casting a weak, yellow glow. He expected to see park layouts, botanical lists, municipal budgets. Instead, the first page was a glossy rendering of a glass and steel monolith. Whitcomb Plaza, a premier luxury living experience. There was no park. There was no green space. He flipped through the pages, his breath hitching. The buyout wasn't coming from the city. It was a private firm called Apex Holdings. And there, on the final signature page, were the names of the primary partners: Elena Whitcomb, Silas Whitcomb. They had used their positions, her as a planner, him as the law, to engineer a seizure of their own family land so they could sell it to themselves at a fraction of its value. They weren't just clearing out the store. They were murdering their father's legacy for a seat at a table they'd never been invited to. Dale slumped against the seat, the paper fluttering in his hand. He was alone, a fugitive in his own town, holding the proof that his blood was colder than the steel in his garage. The sun hadn't even cleared the horizon when the first hammer blow fell. Dale, having caught an hour of fitful sleep in the truck, drove past the hardware store on a whim, his heart sinking at the sight. Silas was there, his cruiser blocking the entrance, but he wasn't alone. A city work crew was with him. Silas was personally wielding a heavy industrial stapler, slapping bright orange "condemned" notices across the century-old glass. The adhesive was thick, a permanent stain on the storefront. Silas moved with a grim, performative energy, making sure every passerby saw the sheriff declaring the building a public hazard. He was turning the store into a leper, a place to be feared and avoided. Dale pulled the truck to the curb, the engine idling roughly. He stepped out, his body aching from the night's violence. Silas saw him and handed the stapler to a deputy, his face setting into a mask of cold authority. He marched to the edge of the sidewalk, stopping just inches from Dale. "You've got 24 hours, Dale. Public Safety Code 402. The foundation is compromised. If you're caught inside after dawn tomorrow, I'm taking you in for child endangerment and trespassing. This isn't a family dispute anymore. It's a matter of the law." The hypocrisy was so thick, Dale could almost taste it. Silas was using the badge to protect his investment, accelerating the clock so Dale wouldn't have time to think, let alone fight. Structural instability. Dale rasped, gesturing to the solid brickwork. "This place will be standing when your plastic plaza is a ruin, Silas." His brother didn't flinch. "The report is signed and filed. 24 hours. Get your personal effects and get out. Don't make me put you in a cell for your own good." Silas turned his back, a calculated insult, and went back to his orange posters. Dale stood on the pavement, the morning heat already beginning to shimmer off the asphalt. He had one day to turn a conspiracy into a scandal. He climbed back into the truck, his mind racing. There was only one place left where the truth might matter. The office of the Hollow Creek Gazette smelled of stale coffee and the ghosts of dead deadlines. Margaret, the editor, sat behind a desk piled high with yellowing archives, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She didn't look up when Dale slammed the manila folder onto her desk. "I need you to run this, Maggie. All of it. The park is a lie. My siblings are the ones buying the land. It's a fraud, top to bottom." He waited for the spark of journalistic fire, for the predatory gleam in her eyes that usually accompanied a local scandal. Instead, she just sighed, her pen tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against her teeth. She didn't even open the folder. She looked at Dale with a pity that felt like a slap. "I can't help you, Dale." He blinked, stunned. "What do you mean? It's all right there. Signatures, bank records, the whole damn thing." Maggie leaned back, her chair creaking. The Gazette receives 60% of its ad revenue from the development's primary donors. Elena's friends in the city council made it very clear that certain stories are bad for business. She looked toward the window, her voice dropping. This town is small, Dale, and the people building that plaza are very big. I'm sorry. Go home. Dale realized then that the rot went deeper than his family. The entire system had been greased with the same oil. He drove back to his garage, his head spinning, only to find the world shrinking further. His truck hit the driveway and let out a sickening, rhythmic thump, thump. He hopped out and saw the damage. All 4 tires had been sliced, deep, jagged gashes that ruined the sidewalls. He ran to the side door and found the phone lines ripped from the siding, the copper wires dangling like dead snakes. He stood in the center of his driveway, looking at the quiet trees, the suburban peace of his neighborhood now feeling like a trap. No one was visible. No cars sped away. It was a silent, professional warning. We can touch you whenever we want. Paranoia is a heavy coat, and Dale wore it all night. He patrolled the perimeter of the hardware store with a heavy maglite, the beam cutting through the Missouri humidity. He checked every window, every shadowed corner of the alley, but found nothing. No footprints in the soft dirt, no cigarette butts, no signs of the men who had sabotaged his life. It was as if he were being hunted by ghosts. He knew the terrain better than anyone, knew the way the wind whistled through the gaps in the siding, yet he felt like a stranger in his own skin. Every rustle of a leaf was a footstep, every shadow was a blade. He retreated into the only place he felt safe, the basement of the store. It was a cavernous, damp space filled with the detritus of 3 generations. He began tearing into dusty crates, his hands moving with a frantic, desperate energy. He was looking for older records, for anything that linked Apex Holdings to the Whitcombs before the official buyout started. He needed a history of the lie. He found a stack of ledgers from 5 years ago, the ink fading but the names still legible. He crouched on the dirt floor, the single bare bulb overhead flickering, his mind so focused on the page that he didn't hear the creak of the stairs. The first blow caught him in the ribs, a sharp, localized explosion of pain that sent him sprawling across the concrete. 2 men, shadows in denim and work boots, moved into the light. No badges, no uniforms, just the heavy, blunt instruments of hired muscle. Dale scrambled back, his breath coming in ragged hitches. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The older one, a bulldog of a man with a flattened nose, swung a short length of rebar. Dale ducked, the metal whistling over his head and smashing into a shelf of paint cans. This wasn't a warning. This was an ending. Silas had sent the professionals to ensure the structural instability included Dale's rib cage. He was cornered near the old furnace, the smell of mildew and rust thick in his throat. The thugs closed in, their movements synchronized. Dale's hand brushed against a crate of old supplies. His fingers found a row of lacquer cans, their labels peeling. As the bulldog lunged, Dale grabbed 2 cans and slammed them against the edge of a steel support beam. The pressurized containers ruptured, spraying a thick, acrid mist of volatile chemicals directly into the faces of his attackers. The thugs screamed, clutching their eyes as the lacquer burned through their sight. The air turned toxic, a shimmering cloud of poison in the dim light. Dale didn't stay to watch them crawl. He knew he couldn't make it back up the stairs. He turned toward the back wall, toward the narrow, soot-stained coal chute that hadn't been used since the 50s. He scrambled up the pile of debris, the metal edges of the chute tearing at his clothes and skin. It was a tight, suffocating squeeze. The soot filling his lungs, the walls pressing in on his chest. He pushed with everything he had, his boots slipping on the slick metal, until he burst through the rusted exterior door and tumbled into the alley. He lay in the dirt, covered in black grime and chemical spray, gasping for air that didn't taste like death. He was shivering, despite the heat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the blueprints he'd snatched from the basement crate just before the attack. He crawled under the shelter of a dumpster and clicked on a small pen light. His eyes widened as he traced the schematics. The luxury hub was a shell, a series of hollow facades. Beneath the high-end boutiques and condos lay a massive subterranean grid of reinforced concrete and specialized drainage. It wasn't a mall. It was a private toxic waste processing facility. The kind of place that was illegal in 3 states, but could be hidden here under the guise of urban renewal. The realization was a hammer blow to his heart. The facility was designed to sit directly atop the town's primary aquifer. One leak, one unforeseen structural failure, and the water table for the entire county would be poisoned for a century. Silas and Elena weren't just stealing a store. They were selling the town's very life for a payout that would let them retire to the coast while their neighbors died of thirst. The county fair was tomorrow. The grand opening, the final signing. It was the only time the whole town would be in one place. Dale clutched the blueprints, the grime on his face mixing with tears of pure, cold rage. He had a plan. The St. Louis County Fair was a cacophony of neon lights, fried dough, and the rhythmic thumping of a tilt-a-whirl. Dale moved through the crowd like a ghost, his face hidden under a low-brimmed cap, his bruised ribs taped tight under his shirt. He was 50 yards from the main stage when the hand clamped onto his shoulder. He didn't even have time to turn before Silas's voice hissed in his ear. "I told you what would happen, Dale." Before he could react, Silas and a deputy had him pinned against a livestock fence. The handcuffs clicked shut with a finality that felt like a tombstone. "Assault on a peace officer," Silas announced to the staring crowd. "Take him to the trailer." The holding cell was a windowless metal trailer parked behind the grandstand, a sweltering box that hummed with the vibration of the fair. Silas shoved Dale inside, the heat hitting him like a physical weight. Dale slumped against the corrugated wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Silas stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the fair lights. "You just couldn't let it go, could you? You had to be the hero of a story that ended years ago." He slammed the door, the heavy bolts sliding home. Dale was trapped. The blueprints sitting in a bag on the floor of Silas's cruiser, the clock ticking toward the moment Elena would step onto the stage. The trailer was a furnace. Outside, the muffled sound of a brass band signaled the start of the opening ceremony. Dale hammered on the walls, his shouts lost in the roar of the crowd. He felt the desperation clawing at his throat. Then, a soft scratch at the small barred vent near the ceiling. "Dale? You in there?" It was Lorna, the clerk Elena had fired 6 months ago. Her face appeared in the gap, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw them take you. Silas is distracted, talking to the mayor." She reached through the bars, her hand trembling as she dropped a small, heavy object into the dark. A pair of industrial wire strippers and a portable radio. "Godspeed, Dale." He didn't waste a second. He dropped to his knees, his fingers finding the electronic keypad on the interior of the door. It was a cheap, municipal-grade lock, the kind he'd serviced a dozen times. He used the wire strippers with a surgical precision, his hands steady despite the sweat pouring down his face. He bypassed the main circuit, the mechanical clicking of his work masked by the booming voice of the announcer introducing Elena. Click, spark, buzz. The green light on the panel flickered, then held steady. The bolt retracted with a soft thud. He cracked the door, peering out into the chaos of the fairgrounds. He moved like a shadow through the livestock pens, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air. He needed the blueprints, but Silas was already back on the move, patrolling the perimeter of the grandstand. Dale ducked behind a row of equipment tents, his eyes scanning for the black and white cruiser. He saw it parked near the cattle barns, the bag still on the front seat. He lunged for it, his fingers brushing the door handle, when a shadow detached itself from the side of a barn. Silas. No deputy, no badge in sight, just a brother who had finally run out of patience. The first punch caught Dale in the mouth, the taste of copper, immediate and sharp. They tumbled into the mud behind the barns, a raw, silent struggle of limbs and hate. Silas was younger, stronger, and trained in the art of inflicting pain. He rained blows down on Dale's head and chest. Each hit a punctuation mark on 30 years of resentment. "You were always the failure." Silas spat, his face contorted. "The one who stayed behind. The one Dad didn't even trust with a key." He punctuated the sentence with a heavy tactical boot to Dale's ribs. Dale heard the snap, a sound like a dry branch breaking, and the world went white. He lay in the mud, gasping, the air refusing to enter his lungs. Silas stood over him, his chest heaving, his uniform stained with filth. He leaned down, his voice a cruel whisper. "You want to know the best part, Dale? Dad didn't leave the store to all of us. He left it to me and Elena, every brick. He wrote you out 5 years before he died. He knew you'd just let it rot." The words hurt more than the broken ribs. The legacy he'd been fighting for, the ghost he'd been trying to please. It had all been a lie. He wasn't the guardian of the flame. He was just a squatter in a house that didn't want him. Silas looked at his watch, then back at his broken brother. "Stay in the dirt, Dale. It's where you belong." He turned and walked toward the stage, where Elena was already beginning her speech, her voice amplified to a godlike roar. Dale lay in the mud, the cold water seeping into his clothes. He looked at his hands, scarred, greasy, shaking. He thought about the town, about the water, about the people who still came to the store because they knew he'd give them the right bolt for free. He wasn't fighting for a dead man's approval anymore. He was fighting for the living. He crawled. It was a slow, agonizing process, his body screaming with every inch. He moved under the shadows of the grandstand, the thunderous applause for Elena's promises of prosperity and growth, masking his groans. He reached the main utility area, a fenced-off section of humming transformers and thick conduits. He knew this grid. He'd helped install the main junction box 5 years ago when the fairgrounds were upgraded. He pulled the wire strippers from his belt, his fingers finding the security panel. He didn't need a key. He was the man who fixed things. He bypassed the main breaker, his mind a map of circuits and frequencies. He took the portable radio Lorna had given him and stripped the auxiliary cable, tapping directly into the fairground's central audio hub. Then he pulled his phone, cracked but functional, and patched it into the Jumbotron's digital feed. His hands moved with a frantic, beautiful clarity. He wasn't a failure. He was a mechanic. And he was about to dismantle the biggest engine of lies this town had ever seen. On the stage, Elena was smiling, a pen in her hand, the contract laid out on a mahogany table. "A new era for Hollow Creek," she announced. Suddenly, the Jumbotron behind her flickered. The glossy renderings of the plaza vanished, replaced by a high-resolution scan of the toxic waste blueprints. The crowd went silent. The images shifted. Technical data on the water table, the chemical storage vats, the secret drainage pipes. Then, the audio cut in. It wasn't Elena's polished drawl. It was Silas's voice, raw and mocking, recorded by the phone Dale had left active in the mud. the one Dad didn't even trust with a key. "Stay in the dirt, Dale. The water safety doesn't matter, the payout does." The silence that followed was absolute. A vacuum of shock. Elena froze, her pen hovering over the paper, her face turning the color of ash. Silas emerged from the wings, his eyes darting to the screen, his hand instinctively reaching for a radio that was now useless. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. A low, angry murmur began to rise from the thousands of people in the grandstand. A sound like a coming storm. The donors on stage stepped back, their faces masks of horror as they realized they were standing in the center of a crime scene. Silas tried to move, to run for the utility shed, but the path was blocked. A wall of local residents, men in flannel, women with strollers, the very people Silas was supposed to protect, closed in. They didn't use weapons. They just used their weight, their collective rage, to pin him against the stage. State police, alerted by the broadcast, moved in from the perimeter. They didn't go for Dale. They went for the siblings. Handcuffs clicked, not on a fugitive, but on a sheriff and a planner. The luxury development collapsed in the space of a heartbeat. Dale sat alone on the porch of the hardware store an hour later. The fair was a distant hum of sirens and shouting. He held the deed in his hand, the real one, the one he'd found in the folder. He had won. The store was his, the land was safe, and the water would remain pure. But as he looked at the empty street, at the condemned signs still fluttering in the wind, he felt the weight of the victory. He had saved the town, but he had burned his family to do it. He was the king of a ghost town, a man with a wrench and a store, sitting in the silence of a legacy that had finally, mercifully, come to an end. He closed his eyes and listened to the creak of the porch swing, the only sound in a world that was finally, truly quiet.